Hi guys, Jackie with Famished Farm, and we are in the kitchen today making pesto. We harvested a ton of fresh pesto the other day, and this is what happened in the hours after the harvest. It allows for a lot of experimentation with the type of greens you use. Use cilantro, parsley, spinach, kale, mustard greens. Use whatever you've got an overabundance of. And your cheese, play around with that too. Maybe not Parmesan, how about Romano? Maybe some Asiago, even miso instead of cheese. Now, the nuts I've played around with a lot. In my area, pine nuts can be really expensive. So I've made basil walnut pesto, and I've really thought about using pistachios, pepitas, almonds, cashews, you name it. So if price is keeping you from making your own pesto, play around with the ingredients and you can find something that will work in your budget and will give you just an overabundance of pesto for the winter month without having to buy it from the grocery store. So guys, let's get cooking. This pesto came right out of the garden and into my sink full of water. I let it sit a couple minutes and then I drained it onto these kitchen towels that are clean, of course. And I just kind of let them hang out for a little bit to let the extra water seep into the towels. And then I take my salad spinner, my lettuce spinner, and I take all the leaves off, destem all of this basil. Now, I talked a little bit about the different type of greens that you can use to make basil, and that's why it is just wonderful. I know for years I didn't make basil because I just thought it was too expensive, buying those little packets of basil at the store. This was before I decided that I needed about a dozen basil plants in my herb garden. Now I can make this a couple times a year and I have plenty for pizza, pasta, just snacking on throughout the winter months, throughout the whole year, really. Even when I have all of those basil plants, sometimes the recipe falls like the last batches of the season. I may not have a full 2 cups packed to make a recipe, so I supplement, and often it's with parsley because I usually have an overabundance of that also. But you could use any green. Just start playing around with what's in your garden. That last batch of the season, if you don't have enough basil, give another green a try. Even in combination with basil, I'm sure will be just delicious. Cheeses, I'm pretty much a Parmesan girl when it comes to what I use, but some people swear by Romano. You do you, but play around if you feel like it. So probably over an hour has elapsed since I first took the basil out of the water. And it does take a good 35 minutes, 40 minutes to destem all of this basil. It's a project. Easy, you just got to be on your feet. It's not a big deal. And I do use that spinner to get the extra water out, and then I put these on paper towels from there. And I will thin these out a little bit once I have all of my basil rather, destemmed. The first couple of years that I made pesto, I only used pine nuts as the nut. The traditional pesto, was pine nuts. And I really did play around with that. The price of pine nuts back then, I think it was $4 for those little packets. And again, I'm pretty much shopping at Walmart for this kind of thing. And I had a pack of pine nuts go bad, and that really hurt the pocketbook. So good tip is to store your pine nuts sealed up in their little bag is fine, but keep them in the freezer. Then your pine nuts won't go bad. Now, every year I will buy 1 pack of pine nuts and then I'll substitute other nuts for the pine nuts just based on, once I run out of pine nuts. So maybe I'll have a couple batches with walnuts, or I haven't tried the cashews. That sounds really good. I think I did use the almonds one year. But I love these suggestions for pistachios. I think that would be awesome to use pistachios or pepitas, pumpkin seeds in your pesto. That would be another great addition. I hope to have some pumpkins in the garden this year. I guess I just need to figure out how to shell the pumpkin seeds to get to the pepita easier. Do any of you guys have a suggestion for that if you're growing your own pumpkins and saving the seeds? So let's talk about this recipe. And as I said, originally published in the New York Times in 1986. Florence Fabricant is the person that wrote the recipe. And this recipe has thousands and thousands of comments. And I think it's like a 4.5-star recipe. So it's just tried and true. And many of the comments, though, talk about their substitutions. And that's how I came up with a lot of these ideas for substituting different greens for the basil, if you want to, veer away from the traditional basil pesto. I think it's just a wonderful idea to kind of play with and learn what you like. Make small batches if you want to play around with different nuts, cheeses, or greens, and till you find what you really love. And who says that having a couple different kinds of pesto in your freezer is a bad thing? I think that would be super nice too. So here's the basic recipe. 2 cups of fresh basil leaves with no stems. 2 tablespoons pine nuts or walnuts. 2 large cloves of garlic. 1/2 cup of extra virgin olive oil. And 1/4 cup of freshly grated Parmesan cheese. And the method to prepare it is pretty easy. You're going to need a food processor, and I'm sorry, there's not a easy way around that. You could probably get by with using a food chopper if you have that instead, but you really need to get this into a pretty fine mince, and there's just no way unless you're super fast with your knife skills and safe, which I am not. So food processor for me it is. And basically, you're just going to load your basil, pine nuts, and walnuts into the food processor and process until fairly finely minced. Now, I typically don't add all of the oil up front, and I typically add less oil than it calls for. So, for instance, I might make a 4-cup batch and use 1/4 cup of olive oil. But I'm going to be honest with you, I really don't measure. I just start the food processor with a little bit of oil in it, and then I drizzle olive oil till it's the right consistency. And the only way you're going to know it's the right consistency is to taste it. Taste it and play with it and see what you like. We do eat pesto on crackers occasionally, and so that is my preferred test if I'm making pesto, is grab a cracker and what do you think it tastes like? Does it need more of anything? And if it does, adjust accordingly. I mentioned in another video that a good friend of mine turned me on to pesto years ago. We both did art and craft shows together, and she was kind of the jelly lady. And at one show, she brought her pesto. I guess it was basil season. At that time, I really didn't have much of a garden because I was working too much. And she said, "Hey, have you ever tried pesto?" And I was like, "Nope." And she's like, "Here, you got to try this." And I think I bought 3 jars from her because it was just one of the most delicious things I'd ever tried. It was fabulous. So that is what got me turned on to it. Oh, guys, I just noticed on my recipe that I've got a couple things written in. If you will roast whatever nuts that you're going to use in the pesto, it just sends it over the top. And also, I have even used roasted garlic. I've used dry powdered garlic. I'm not a garlic connoisseur. I like it in a very limited amount. So I'm sure I never have used 4 cloves of garlic, but I do. It is garlic forward for us. But roast your garlic. I had some in the freezer one time and added that to pesto. It was really good. And hey, nobody says that you have to stop at a half a cup per recipe of whatever cheese you're using. Use more if you like. And like we do, we probably use less. But that's just us. This is now hours later. I have taken the basil leaves and fluffed them up and, made sure that the underneath basil is getting dried. So it's been several hours to get these to air dry. So I'm going to take a packed 4-cup measure and I'm going to add about half of that to my food processor to start. So here we go. We've got pine nuts. I'm going to add a 1/4 cup. This is a 2 tablespoon measure of Parmesan. So I'm using half the cheese. And because of that, I'm going to add some salt. And this is going to become part of a double batch, guys. So realize that. If I had added the full amount of cheese, I would not use salt or pepper. I add a little lemon juice for color to keep the color nice and green. And then that was olive oil. And that is my first addition. Now, I'll just let this process, but you'll notice you can't see the bottle, but I am streaming in olive oil as it goes. I will stop the food processor occasionally and just scrape down the sides of the bowl to make sure everything is getting mixed in. I could see there that there's some bigger leaves and some of the cheese are not getting mixed in. And then I'm going to add the rest of that 4 cups of basil. And obviously I'm going to be adding more oil too. And then we're just going to process this again. And consistency wise, it's going to probably be a pretty individual thing. But again, you want this very finely minced. I'm going to scrape this down again. And you'll see it's still kind of thick. It doesn't flow. And I don't want it liquid by any stretch, but I do want there to be a little more olive oil in it. So we'll put another stream of olive oil in it. On my food processor, I can kind of hear a change in the sound of the motor when I know that I've reached my desired consistency. We're going to go a little longer here. And I do a quick taste test here, and I've added about another tablespoon of Parmesan. And I probably could have gone either way, either a little more salt or a little more cheese. I opted for cheese there. And now, again, playing with the processing on this, and it's getting closer. We're probably going to scrape this down another time, and then a little more olive oil, and I think we've about got this batch. Oh, I decided a little more oil. Now notice when I stop processing this time and I scrape it down, when I scrape it down, it kind of flows over the blade right there. See how that flows? So we're getting pretty close. I want it to be a little more than that, so we'll process a little longer. And just a little more olive oil. Keep processing. I guess how this processing begs the question, could you over-process it? And I don't really know the answer to that. I can just tell you that in all the years I've been making pesto now, I have not reached that point yet. So you'll notice in the background there, I've got a jar with my canning funnel on it. And that is a jar from a different batch that I've made today. And I'm going to, when I finish this jar, I am going to give it a good stir to just combine the 2 batches. So at least in that jar, they're cohesive. On this day, I made 2 pints plus another half pint or so that I added to the jar that I keep in my refrigerator. And you'll see here, this is, I'm trying to mix this up pretty good just so it's well incorporated. Now, I've seen pesto that's a lot more liquid than I prefer it. And again, that's going to be a personal preference thing. If you like more olive oil, please add more olive oil. This is just the way that we like it. Now, I've cleaned off the lid, and this is, I'm reusing a lid there. You'll see this is a lid that has already been processed. We're not doing any kind of water bath or pressure canning. This is going into the freezer. This is how I preserve pesto. Now, I'm writing that it's a basil pesto. I sometimes write that I use pine nuts or whatever other types of nuts I use, and then the date. And then here you'll see I make sure that there's a good layer of olive oil on top of the jar, and that's just so that the pesto on top doesn't turn dark. We'll cap that. This is the one that's living in my refrigerator right now. This one I'm going to top off the olive oil on the top too, and this just takes, you know, roughly a tablespoon of olive oil just to make sure that it's covered. So this is our day of preparing pesto. I'm wondering, what kind of pesto do you guys like? Are there favorite greens or nuts or cheeses that you add, or recipes that you use the pesto in? I am a huge proponent of pesto pizza with fresh tomatoes, mozzarella, and pesto as the sauce. We do that every couple of months. And here I am, there it goes, tucked in with the other jars of pesto, if I can make room. But that was a great day of preserving our fresh basil. Thanks for watching, guys.